in our approach to life's intractable problems, these difficult problems that appear to us to have no solution, in staying with them and trying to figure out a way to work with them, we find that working with our own mind, finding a way to discipline our approach to these problems, we find that peace, we find that serenity, that ability to transcend that inevitable suffering that's there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado, and I'm here with Dr. Rob Maldonado.
Good to be here.
And we have another exciting episode continuing our series on the great minds of philosophy. And today we're going to talk about the great Buddha, Buddhism. But before we begin, I want to remind you, if you're watching us on YouTube, please click the button here in the corner and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss a single episode of Soul Sessions. So I love every episode of this series because I love philosophy. But when I first met you, that's where, I was like into Buddhism. You were really into it. You were going to a Buddhist center in Denver. And so I don't know if we want to start talking about that a little bit and just how we got interested. Yeah,
I definitely want to dedicate this talk to all our Buddhist friends around the world. Great work and great philosophy. And to restate, we're approaching Buddha's work as a philosopher. We always reserve that approach because it allows us to ask questions instead of accepting things as religion. We approach it as a philosophy.
And we do know that some people are Buddhists and they study religion, and that's not where we're about, like teaching the religion of Buddha, but his great teachings. And so who was Buddha?
Back to Denver, it was a difficult time in my life, and I really needed an anchor, something to just give me some peace of mind. And luckily for me, they talk about it as taking refuge. I took refuge in this little Buddhist center where they taught meditation every day. I could walk over there. It was a couple of blocks from where I was living and just meditate. And that to me was a lifesaver. It was just what I needed. It centered me. It helped me focus. Meditation was a lifesaver. I can't express my gratitude enough to the teachers there in that center.
I remember when you met me, Rob had just met me. The reason why he was in such disarray, no, I'm kidding. He had met me a couple months later, right? After you moved to, it was like 2 or 3 months after you moved to Denver. And Rob and I had just met. And so he didn't know all the wacky stuff I used to do with spirituality. And he said to me, okay, I'd love for you to come to this Buddha center with me. It's a meditation, but don't freak out. There's going to be deities and pictures and all. Like he was like preparing me not to get freaked out about it. And I was fine with it because I've been through many bizarre temples and all this stuff. So I thought it was so funny that you warned me. You thought I would be scared by it, but he didn't know me at that point yet enough to know that not shying away from things that aren't normal. But yeah, too, I remember I was reading a lot of Pema Chodron at the time, and just different Buddhist philosophers, Zen Buddhism. And I really love the simplicity of the idea of the mind and how it works. And of course, I was a hypnotherapist at the time, so I loved anything that taught about the mind. So wonderful, wonderful impact on my life as well, and actually led me to learn more of the roots of Buddhism with the Upanishads and Vedanta and all that. So it started me on that journey of really studying it in a serious way. And beautiful, beautiful work and great stories and metaphors for life. But Buddha, he was around 800 BC? Is that where he started?
A little bit earlier. Yeah, about 500-600 BC.
And he was a prince?
Yeah, so the story, very kind of mythological, hard to say how much truth or mythology is in there, but it doesn't matter, right? Because it's a lesson in being in the world. So the idea is that he grew up as a prince, sheltered from the outside world until he was in his early 20s, maybe a little bit younger. By that time, he was married and had a son. And then he stepped outside of his sheltered life. And of course, he was confronted with aging, illness, and death, which are, we know, universal things that make us suffer as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And they're universal in that we all have to experience and we all have to confront these things.
Mm-hmm.
So aging, illness, and death kind of woke him up to the life he was living of luxury,
Mm-hmm.
pleasure, and being cut off from direct experience of those things.
Mm-hmm. He was like cushioned or sheltered from it in his palace, and but the average ordinary person in the town was having all these problems and suffering.
So he sets out to solve this problem, this riddle of, can we escape suffering, or are we doomed to just toughen our way through it, and bite our lip and accept it as that's just the nature of existence, that we have to suffer in this world. So he set out, renounced his princehood, left his wife and family, and set out to become an ascetic, a wanderer, a seeker.
Didn't he like visit all the different types of religious sects in India? There were so many, and kind of met with different ones, and was basically trying to discover the answers.
Yeah, the story goes that he actually took on a couple of gurus.
Mm-hmm.
So he practiced with them, and essentially focused and concentrated on their particular teachings, and fasted so much that there's a few sculptures of him where he's skin and bones, because he was so intently seeking the answer to this question of suffering and causing suffering upon himself, in essence. But he was disillusioned in the end and decided to pursue his own path after a few years of studying.
And through his inner, and he did that through inner work, like going inside.
Absolutely. Very much the traditions at that time, and they're still around, of course, was to meditate, to discipline the mind, to castigate the body, in essence, to bring it under the control of the higher mind, so that the individual could gain that freedom. So anyway, disillusioned with the practices of his gurus, he sets off on his own, and one day just decides, I'm going to sit under this banyan tree, and I'm not going to get up until I solve this question.
The Bodhi tree, right?
Yes. Is there a way out of suffering? Or are we doomed to suffer forever? And he sat there until he reached enlightenment. And after enlightenment, then he sticks around. A lot of people don't kind of mention his ministry, right? His kind of getting up from that tree and from under that tree, and actually doing the hard work of building a sangha, a community of followers, and teaching them his new method of escaping suffering.
And so those are what he calls the Four Noble Truths.
He worked all his life on teaching his methodologies. At the age of 80, he passes away.
Long life.
Long life, so did a lot of work.
And he said, whatever you do, do not make statues of me. Do not bow to me. And guess what? Some people didn't listen, because you see statues of Buddha all over the world, in every temple, and he carves out in mountains and all over. So yeah, it's funny how he didn't want to be known. Like he was more like, you can do this. Like I'm not special. Like I've just found the way, and everyone has that capacity.
Yeah, he definitely insisted on his human nature. In other words, he wasn't pretending to be a god. They asked him, "What are you? Are you an angel, a god, some kind of apparition?" He said, "No, I am simply awake. In other words, I'm a human being that's awake, and if you want to do it, here's a way to do it." So that's the great message, the great philosophy of the Buddha, is that you and I, as human beings, can do what he did. We can wake ourselves up, and he sets out this method of doing it. So in other words, he's saying, lift yourself up, right, by your own mind, by your own bootstraps, and do it, because no one else can do it for you, and no one will do it for you. One of our teachers used to say that no one is coming to rescue you.
Yeah.
There's no one coming to save you. You better do the work yourself, or stay there and suffer.
Like wait for that lottery ticket.
Yeah.
So let's get into the Four Noble Truths. Let's go through all of them, and then we'll go back and go deep into them. But that life is suffering is the first one, which people hear that and they're like, oh, I don't like Buddhism. I actually had a friend of mine say, oh, I don't like Buddhism because they think life is suffering. I'm like, that's only the first truth. The second one is that there is a reason for the suffering. There's a source of that suffering. The third noble truth is that there's a way out of that suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the path out of it, is the way. And we'll go into that. But the first one, life is suffering, I think it's sort of like a bitter pill we have to swallow, is that this delusion that life is supposed to be happy all the time, that everything's supposed to go smoothly. And if you've had a difficult childhood or difficult things happen, that something's wrong with you, that there's some, you shouldn't be suffering. Everyone should just be happy. And if you're unhappy then, or depressed, somehow there's something wrong with you. But it's kind of to understand that human nature is like, with our mind, that the way it is, it causes suffering. We have this suffering. There's sickness. We're never happy when we're sick. There's always death that comes, and then aging. Come on, how many people are happy every time a birthday comes around and they look in the mirror? Like it's like this. We have this kind of feeling of wanting to stay young forever and all those things. So, yes. Those are the nature of the suffering, is that birth, aging, sickness, and death. Right,
and what they all have in common is that life is impermanent. They're pointing to this idea that whatever happiness you're experiencing, whatever youth you have, whatever power and wealth and vitality you have, is temporary. So the Buddha is simply saying, philosophically, you have to be aware of this, or acknowledge it and be very cognizant of it. Otherwise, you're fooling yourself. If you're thinking, if I can just get more pleasure and get more money or more health or more success, I'll be fine, right? I'm going to be fine. You're deluding yourself, because that's not how things work. He says, face that ultimate challenge of, these are truths that we all have to face. We all have to deal with. Why try to ignore them and pretend that things are going to be fine?
You're going to live forever.
Yeah, that you're just going to go on forever experiencing these things. It's only going to lead to a greater suffering, instead of acknowledging them and saying, okay, if this is the case, how can I proceed? How can I live my life with the true understanding of its impermanent nature?
They even have a meditation to meditate on death, which is it feels dark, but it really is liberating if you understand it. And I remember when our first place in Denver that we lived, there was a path, a walking path, and it actually led through a cemetery, remember? And we were like talk about meditating on death. We're surrounded by death, and it's just like, it's to be aware. It makes your life so precious. They talk about the precious human life, to make the most out of this precious human life. And those of you who are listening to this podcast and you're hearing this message, you're very rare, someone as a human being, to be conscious of hearing these kind of teachings, even if you don't understand it or don't agree with it, but you're hearing it, which is huge, the opportunity for enlightenment for you to escape that suffering.
There's a beautiful story. I just want to add it to this piece. So this woman had lost her little girl.
Oh yeah, I love this story.
And she comes to him inconsolable, of course, just in that suffering of grieving, right, of losing somebody so precious in their lives. And so he hears her out, and then he finally says, okay, I can help you. Here's what you're going to do. Go from house to house, and when you find a house that has a household that has not lost anyone in their family, bring me some seeds from that household to me, and then I will give you the next instruction. So he gladly seeks out or goes out to and knock on doors, right? And to try to find a house where no one has died. The family has not lost anyone. And of course, she soon realizes that there is no one like that. There is no household where people don't lose loved ones.
And she realized that she wasn't alone. And she came to him in tears and broke down. And she said, I couldn't find one, but I got what the message was that you wanted me to hear. And when we're suffering, we feel like we're the only ones in the world that can suffer, that can feel this way or have this experience. And death is one of those that it affects us all.
Yeah, and I think it turns it around also that the other side of our grieving is compassion.
Mm-hmm.
It is what allows us to be compassionate towards others in a true sense, because we understand that what they're going through, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in that woman, in meeting other people that had lost loved ones, then she understood that, oh, my heart can go out to them. I can help them. I can soothe their suffering as well in my own grieving, and understanding my own grieving. So it is the seed and the source of real compassion, our own suffering.
Yeah. When my dad died, we went to the flower shop to pick out the flowers for his casket. And while we were there, young woman was there, a bride, and she was planning her wedding. And I was thinking about how interesting, we're both in the same place for two different reasons. And I'm so sad. And this is such a happy occasion, and it's the same place. And it sort of reminded me of that temporariness of life, is that she would probably, we're sitting in that chair too. And, we've all had those happy moments and sad moments. So that, the suffering is not only that bad things happen, but the suffering is that even good things don't last in the human life. Yeah. So let's go to 2. What's the cause of suffering, Rob?
Right.
Let's just cut it out, nip it at the bud.
So let's say in philosophical terms, Buddha identifies craving and attachment as the primary sources of our suffering. Craving and attachment to what? Well, if you think about aging, we're attached to our youth. We want to stay young. We want to stay healthy. We want to reminisce about the good old days, right? Glory days. Like
you always say that. When I tell him a story from my past, he's like, glory days. And then also like pleasurable experiences. We always think about, oh, I want to go on that vacation, or I want to take a spa day, or I want to be in love. Those things that we want.
Yeah,
have a child.
There's nothing wrong with these things. Yeah. It's simply that if we think of them as the source of our happiness, like our happiness and our power and our youth is going to come from obtaining these things, and we get attached to them, that's the cause of the suffering, not the things themselves. In other words, the root of our suffering is within our own mind.
And it's the ego-driven, like this kind of sense of I, separateness that we feel in our life from the outer world, and that ego-driven desire.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the mind is the cause of suffering.
Our attachment and our craving. So this is common to all or most of these traditions that grew out of the Upanishads and the Vedic traditions, is that they emphasize the disciplining of the mind. Easy for me to say, right? You have to discipline your mind. Otherwise, it goes on very basic cravings. It wants comfort. It wants, like you say,
it's like autopilot, right?
Yeah, that ego comfort of, a comfort zone. It wants to stay in its comfort zone. It wants easy things.
Like you say, people want to sit by the fire with their blanket and with their cat in their nice little cozy house with their little books and just stay inside. A
little hobbit hole.
Yeah, their little hobbit house. And when the world has so much adventure, but it's too much risk. So, so that cause of the mind to crave more, to feel dissatisfaction all the time. It's like never enough, because nothing lasts. Like even when you fall in love with someone, that love that you felt when you first met, it changes. It changes in form. It's not the same thing. When you have success, the money, it goes in and out. Like you don't just like pile a bunch of money in the bank and never spend money again. It's money is this kind of always ever changing thing. And then also the value of money goes up and down and all that stuff too. But you can't really hang on to anything, and when people, you know, I remember when my dad died, I think death is such a wake-up call because you start thinking about your death in life. And I remember thinking that you can't hang on to anything. I was looking at all the pictures my mother put out of all the Christmases when we were kids. And I'm like, oh my God, that felt like yesterday. And now I'm at my dad's funeral. And it was like, wow, this life goes so fast. And yeah, so that kind of hanging on to the glory days or to your youth or your kids never growing up and never leaving the nest or, you know, like all that stuff, like wanting things to stay still, it doesn't last. So even when you get good stuff. And then also a lot of times it's not even as fulfilling as you think it's going to be. You know, when you get it, you're like, oh, okay, now I want more.
So this is where most people leave the temple probably, right?
They're like,
they don't want to hear this.
Well, and also they think that, and I remember like renunciation, they think that you have to give up your possessions. And if you do want to become a monk, yeah, you have to give up your possessions, you give up your name, all these things. But they're not expecting householders to do that. We have to make a living. We have to have relationships. We're, you know, families and all those things that we want. So it's not about letting go, like attachment, like I don't want anything from this world, but it's to let go of the ego attachment. So let's talk about the cessation of suffering. What's the way out of suffering?
Right. Yeah, so this is the third noble truth, meaning there is a way out of suffering. So,
good news.
So yeah, we started to gain, to see some light at the end of the tunnel, right? That it's not all bad news. The Buddha in his philosophy is saying suffering can be overcome by eliminating or working with that craving and the attachment. So what is the antidote to craving? It is being content with what you have, right? Being grateful and contented with what you have. And accepting, not necessarily just staying there and saying, well, you know, I'm just going, this is as far as I go, but understanding that you have a lot already. If you're well,
so you're not coming from craving, right?
That's right. You're not just kind of perpetuating that craving of wanting more and always thinking that if I get the next thing, I will be happy then. You're understanding that you have to be happy in the moment right now and be content with that. Then you can create the next level of your life in a much more creative way.
Well, it's actually more effective too, because I always say that a lot of people are creating from a deficit. They're in the hole and they want to get out of the hole and then they go to their potential. And it's like, what if we start outside of the hole? What if we're not in a deficit? We're not below the line, but we're good. We've done so much. We're wise already. And now we're just building upon that.
That's right. And then the antidote to attachment, of course, is non-attachment, not detachment. A lot of people interpret it as, well, I'm just not going to care, and I'm not going to care about what's going on in the world, and
like checking out in a way.
Yeah, checking out. That's not what the Buddha means. He means staying engaged in what's going on, paying attention to your mind and your situation, but dropping the attachment to the results, doing your part, doing what you need to do, dropping the attachment to whatever results you get from those actions. And of course, it takes ethical conduct, meaning you have to stop doing crazy things that are causing you more suffering.
And you're looking at me. I don't have to
we
stop
all
doing
do,
crazy
right?
Things.
Whatever it is.
Even the things of obsessive thinking or obsessive worrying, like that's when you say, I hate to use the word crazy in a wellness type of podcast, but no, it's more like this kind of like things that are not helping you. You know, it's not helpful to be obsessed and worried or angry all the time, and all these emotions. It's not to deny them, but to be stewing in it all the time and resentful. We're always worried and always anxious. Like that is not the right way to be. Like not that there's a right or wrong, but a way for you to get out of suffering. That's not. You can't worry yourself out of suffering. Or anger yourself out of suffering.
Cultivating wisdom. In other words, you have to start to read, to re-educate yourself as to, if I don't want to suffer intensely the rest of my life, what is the alternative? And this higher knowledge that the Buddha is teaching and that comes from Eastern philosophy, it gives us a way to re-educate our mind as to what is the nature of this life. And finally, mental discipline.
That's why meditation is so prevalent in the Buddhist practices.
Yeah, meditation. In all Eastern philosophies, from all the way from China to India, you see meditation as a central part of mental discipline. And it is a mental discipline. A lot of people try to use meditation on its own, but on its own, it doesn't have that power because you're kind of just trying to still your mind without really taking it anywhere or not really understanding what the purpose of that is. You think, well, if I just relax and clear my mind,
calm my mind down,
I'll be fine. There is something to that, of course, but without this kind of re-education of the mind, reorienting ourselves to what is the nature of our existence, there's very little benefit, really.
Well, you know what I think too mental discipline speaks to is because we all want to relax, but it's really hard. It's difficult work to teach your mind how to refocus and think. It's how you think about things. It's not really what you think about, but molding your mind and brain to think about life in a different way, to approach difficulties in a different way. That's mental discipline. And you get that through meditating and experiencing yourself and seeing and witnessing your own thoughts and stilling the mind. The last one is their path. And Buddha talks about the Eightfold Path is the path out of suffering. So actually the real nitty gritty here, and we're not going to go into each one because it's 8 of them, but I'm going to read them to you. They're the right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So you start with one and then you kind of work your way to finally getting to that ability to concentrate. But it's all not just thinking positive. It's how you speak, what you're intending, how you're viewing the world, what actions are you taking, what kind of livelihood, like all those things that we talked about in the last one about ethical conduct and mental discipline and wisdom are all in those Eightfold Path.
Yes. And the central message here is that the power is within you, right? If you really want to transcend suffering, I'd say, because I don't like escaping, right? Escaping kind of has that feeling of trying to run away from it. It's more that we stay with it, but we're working with our own mind with the understanding that in our approach to life's intractable problems, right? These difficult problems that appear to us to have no solution, in staying with them and trying to figure out a way to work with them, we find that working with our own mind, finding a way to discipline our approach to these problems, we find that peace, we find that serenity, that ability to transcend that inevitable suffering that's there.
One of the powerful stories we'll end with is this story Shantideva talked about where someone said, how do I, deal with all this life and this suffering in life? And he said, imagine that the world is covered with shards of glass, sharp rocks that can cut you, heat, and you have to walk in. How can you be in the world with all these like sharp objects out there that can hurt you? And he said, you can cover the entire world with leather, or you can wear shoes. And so it's about that you can be in the world with all its shards and all its sharpness and all this harshness. But if you have the shoes, which is the right mind, that you can really participate in the world without feeling the suffering of the world. And that I thought was a beautiful metaphor for what we're doing. We're not trying to cover everything over and make it positive and everything happens for a reason. And, I'm going to take this and make it positive. And that's great, but you also don't want to skip away from what's happening, and you don't want to just avoid it, like you said, escape. But you want to have the right mind around it, where you don't have to run from it, or don't have to make excuses or reframe it in your mind, so you can feel more comfortable. Because the ego mind will try to do that, and it'll sound very spiritual when it does that, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. So we'll leave you with the 3 things that the Buddha recommends as a way to build community and a way to start that process of finding that peace within you that transcends the suffering. So he says, first of all, you have to cultivate a deep trust in the Buddha. In other words, he's saying, find a teacher, find a way or something, some methodology that teaches you how to discipline your mind. Without the teacher, it's very difficult to do it on our own because our mind is very scattered and very easily distracted, right? The second one, he says, is the teachings themselves. There has to be a good methodology that teaches you higher knowledge, the true nature of the mind, the nature of your existence, of reality. Those kind of teachings are invaluable for us. For the real seeker of the mind, you have to depend on real knowledge, higher knowledge. So the Buddha, the teachings that he called the Dharma, and then thirdly, he says the Sangha, the community of like-minded people that can support your learning, your practice, and that you can use as inspiration, right? And support each other. In one of his great quotes, he says, enlighten each other. Enlighten each other, right? Your friends, help them. They help you, you help them, and you together find your way past this suffering of life.
Yeah, being around people that study higher knowledge versus just the people you grew up with or the people you're used to hanging out with, that when you're reading a personal development book, they're like, oh, that's weird stuff. You want to be around people that are growing, wanting to ask life's deeper questions, and they're going to lift you up to out of that suffering of the world, and they're going to truly be a benefit in your life, and you are to them.
Yes.
So thank you, Rob, for bringing up Buddha as one of the topics for our podcast.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week for another great mind of philosophy. We have more to go this summer. If you do not want to miss an episode, please don't forget to subscribe here. Click the button here if you're watching us on YouTube. And go out and find your path out of suffering. Remember that you have the power to do that. And life can be kind as well.